So these European influences are not the only influence in folk music, especially in US folk music origins. As I said before, there's a great cross cultural influence with folk music practice. So, one of these great influences comes from Africa, specifically West African instruments, and so much of this happens due to the transatlantic slave trade we talked about, a couple classes or so ago. And one important folk music instrument that we probably a lot of us recognize today is the banjo. And the banjo actually originated in Africa and was brought over to the United States by the enslaved population. So the first documentation of a banjo was in 1678. And again, think about how close that is to Barbary Allen, which was 1666. So all of these cross-cultural influences are interacting with each other and coming together to create a new type of musical practice in the United States. And so the banjo itself is a lute kind of instrument, so usually a stringed instrument made of natural materials, so something like a gourd, like an actual food item, and then animal skin stretched on top of that gourd to help resonate and amplify the sound. And I always like this picture here because you can see how much of part of everyday slave life the banjo was. It was something that was highly um, attributed to Black culture, especially in the United States and on plantations. And banjos were used all the time to accompany singing, to storytell, to dance. And this was a tradition that was passed down, especially since drums were generally banned on plantations due to fear of them being used for uprisings. So, what starts to happen is that through enslavement and slave culture, the banjo is eventually shared from African Americans to European Americans because African Americans would perform. Some slave masters had slaves perform specifically on fiddles and banjos. And eventually, these practices get shared between both African Americans and European Americans, usually of lower classes, right? Poverty stricken European Americans. And so it creates this bond, at least this musical bond, between, Black people and European people. And so you can see that the design is changed a little bit from that basic gourd we saw before. Notice how this is made out of really natural materials, animal skins, and the like. And what we see here is still that gourd kind of texture, but it's a little bit more circular, or maybe I'll say oval like. A fretless neck where you don't have actual frets to press onto. Still gut strings of an animal, but this is just a slight change in the design. And what's cool about this is that you can, by looking at these different designs of the banjo, you can trace the history. And one thing that changes is that people start to play the banjo a little bit differently. So instead of using just a plucking method with your fingers, people start using this thing called a claw hammer, where they're actually using all five fingers to really claw and hammer down on the strings. All right. So now what we start to see after some cross-cultural influences with the banjo, we see the banjo being used in blackface minstrelsy shows. These are essentially shows that mimic and mock Black people and the idea of slave culture and life, which emerges in the early 1800s, so 19th century. Generally, white performers would paint their faces black, right? These are conversations that we're still having today. And they would caricature, right? They would mock and stereotype what they perceive to be essential African American traits and characteristics. And usually, African Americans were caricatured as these uneducated, irrational, dangerous, and then, unable to care for themselves kind of characters. So the banjo starts to be associated with this, which then changes, right, the meaning the banjo has for enslaved populations, in which it was very meaningful because that was a connection to their home continent of Africa. And now it becomes this tool of mockery, right? Partly because the banjo becomes such a staple of minstrelsy performance. And what also happens is that now it introduces a new audience to the banjo itself, right? So what we have is urban white people, in northern city centers watching these minstrel shows and then associating the banjo practice with the goofiness of African American cultures. So we start to see African American cultures back away from the banjo a little bit at this time. So I'll play a little example here of a pretty famous banjo player, Dean Barber, and he's playing one of these Civil War era banjos that were occurring around that time in the 1800s, just as slavery was getting ready to be abolished, and tensions were high in the country. And this was popularized by a popular minstrel troupe called the Virginia Minstrels.
Old Dan Tucker. I come to town the other night, heard a noise, I saw a fire. Watchman, he was running around saying, Old Dan Tucker, come to town. Get out the way, get out the way, get out the way, old Dan Tucker. Used to lay to get your supper. Tucker, he's a nice old man, used to ride our barn around. Send him whizzing down the hill, hadn't got up, he'd lay there still. Get out the way, get out the way, get out the way, old man Tucker. Used too late to get your supper. Old Dan Tucker, I got drunk, fell in the fire, kicked up a chunk. Charcoal got inside the shoe. Lord have mercy, how the ashes flew. Get out the way, get out the way, get out the way, old man Tucker. Used too late to get your supper.
All right. So you could probably hear that storytelling element that I talked about before. What was a little different was that even though it had this linear narrative, it also had this thing called a refrain, right? This constant part of the music that we always come back to. Get out the way, old Dan Tucker, blah blah blah, right? That's a little bit different than Barbary Allen, right? That was just this constant, ongoing story. Now we have the constant return of certain musical material, and this starts to bring us a little bit closer to the popular music we know today, where we often have a return of consistent material. So the instrument of the banjo itself, it ends up carrying a lot of baggage, right? Because something that was once so meaningful to enslaved people, to African people of the African continent and African descent, uh, it was reappropriated, right, by this minstrel show, by white performers, and now it's become a symbol of white rural culture and white rural values, right? I'm assume for most people when you think of a banjo, right? If you were to assume a social group connected to it, you'd probably think of white rural Southerners, right? That history of the banjo and its origins in Africa, it has been whitewashed and erased in a lot of ways. So this instrument was really important for unifying different racial groups, social classes, socioeconomic classes. And when we trace the history of this particular instrument, we really see how all these cross cultural connections come together to create folk culture in the United States.